Going into this particular event, the entire pharma pack has been under significant pressure. But today, what we're actually seeing is going into the event, a certain amount of short covering has come by, especially in some of the large cap names. So look at names like Lupin, look at names like Aurobindo Pharma, Loris Labs. All of these stocks today are seeing quite a bit of a recovery from the day's lowest points. But on this particular topic, remember, Trump's Liberation Day, the 2nd of April, is nearly here. And investors are awaiting Trump's latest tariff rollout. CNBC's Megan Kessler joins in with more details.
David, I was just inside the White House talking with officials on this to try to bring you guys the latest. And what I can tell you is that deliberations on exactly what tomorrow will look like are still ongoing. There are still meetings scheduled today where they will be talking through the different options that are on the table, and no options have yet been removed from the table. There's three main options that the president is considering here. One is a blanket 20% tariff on most all imports from most all countries that are sending goods into the U.S. Another is sort of a tiered basis, meaning that countries can fall into one of maybe three buckets. There will be maybe just three different rates and tiers of countries depending on the trade barriers that they have up. The third is the option we had previously been talking about the most, sort of a customized country by country approach. One White House official did tell me that that blanket 20% tariff rate, that's still back on the table, but that appears less likely than the other two at this moment in time. Here's what we know about tomorrow. We know it's going to be a 4 p.m. ceremony in the Rose Garden. Most cabinet officials in attendance, some workers, some manufacturers, some CEOs have also been invited. So we'll see who's there in the Rose Garden tomorrow. We know that the goal, they say, is country-based tariffs, not sectoral. So though there's been a lot of talk about pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, we do expect those at this point to come later and not to be announced tomorrow. And then one final thing, guys, is that as big as these reciprocal tariffs could be, they are just one piece of what we're getting tomorrow. And I don't want viewers to forget that we're also expecting the pause on Canada and Mexico imports to be lifted. We're also expecting those secondary tariffs on Venezuela to take effect, and the auto tariffs will take effect, guys. So no matter which of these options on the table that they choose, a big day tomorrow, no matter what, guys.
Indeed, and now only a few hours to go. Madhavi Arora, Chief Economist at Emkay Global Financial Services, is now joining in with her insight. Madhavi, thank you so much. You know, the 2nd April date has been drummed up so much that, you know, everyone thinks it's going to be this big binary event. A lot may change in the next few hours. There are so many closed-door negotiation parlays taking place, and a lot of what we discuss could be in the realm of speculation. But give us your base case, your insights on this particular issue.
Hi, morning. Well, to start with, we don't think the April 2 event would see a resolution in tariff policies, but instead, I think it would be beginning of the next stage of the trade war. So, I think we are in for a much more volatile world that we are assuming. It's just the starting point of the noise that, Trump administration might end up making. As of now, one is still not clear whether the mode of tariff is going to be reciprocal on sectoral basis or on a broad, country level basis, or it will go in the, in the depth of commodity-wise tariff differential treatment that they might end up facing. We might end up facing. So as of now, there's not much of a clarity as to, how the implementation is going to be. It's going to be extremely sketchy. But our assessment suggests that, there's too much noise with regard to this bit as far as India is concerned. Indeed, there are going to be certain sector which would be hit, but there will be a lot of, segments within those sector which could have mitigating impact. So on an average, I think India probably would face roughly around 6 to 7 billion hit on the exports to the US, if at all we get reciprocal tariff on a broad country level basis. But within that also, I think sectors like auto, pharma, electronic, which are seen as the ones which could get hit, probably are much better placed than feared. While we think sectors like apparel, gems and jewelry, they may not have much of an escape route and might end up really facing, the brunt of the tariff noises. But as of now, I think it's extremely sketchy. While numbers are floating here and there, I believe that we're in for a much more volatile world.
Yeah, beginning of a trade war, as you said. So Madhavi, I get that, imposing reciprocal tariffs at an individual commodity level is going to be an accounting nightmare. We've got 200 countries and, on an average, I think about 13,000 items. So we're looking at 2.6 million. So let's keep that, let's keep that on the side for now. If reciprocal tariffs are imposed at an aggregate country level, you said the impact on India could be about 6 billion at 10%. Can you tell us how you've arrived at that math?
So we've basically taken into account the demand elasticities of these commodities which are exposed to the US, whether there's any kind of a substitution effect that we can face immediately, and of course whether we can also sort of find the mitigation route or substitution from India's point of view in terms of these commodities. So net, given the current elasticity of these commodities, we've come out with this number that there would be a marginal hit of around 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP worth of hit in terms of exports.
Madhavi, that's very helpful. You've also, done an analysis where you looked at the imposition of tariffs across three broad sectors, or maybe in three separate ways. The first is broad country-level tariffs. The second is sector-level tariffs. And the third is commodity or sub-sector level tariffs. Analyze this for us, and where do you see the most impact happening, especially for a country like India?
So as I said, so first and foremost, when we study the importance of US as India's market for these sectors that you mentioned, when we see the tariff differential and to try to understand, how gullible these sectors are, we identify that not only India's exports to the US is very concentrated on top sectors, but vast majority of these India's exports are not materially high to be extremely vulnerable in the first place. So overall, India exports roughly around 80 billion plus to the US, which is around 2% of GDP. And the sectors that actually, are gullible or exposed to these tariff noises are roughly around 1.1% of GDP. Of that, also, when we, get into these sectoral analyses like auto, pharma, electronics, as I said, they're extremely noisy in terms of the positioning that they have versus the US and the exposure that they have to the US. But when you end up studying these sectors, like, for example, auto sector, it seems to be a sector which could be massively hit given the differential of tariff that we have with the US. But when you really get into details of that, what we really see is that they're actually insulated from the tariff noise, because 80% of the auto exports that we do to the US are basically components. Only 20% is what we really export as a finished good, and that also is a very small amount in terms of value. So, of course, if at all the tariff reciprocal hit comes into us, auto component sector could be massively hit. But again, since it's going to be a broad country level hit that everybody will face, we can still have a competitive edge compared to the likes of Canada, Mexico, China, which may actually end up facing much higher tariff differential. While we agree that at this point in time, the auto supply chain or value chain is extremely integrated between the US, Canada, and Mexico. But of course, if these kind of differential tariffs come into play, there could be some escape routes and some shifts that could happen away from these countries to actually countries where there could be a relatively less higher tariff that US may end up imposing. Same with electronics. If we look at the electronic component exposure to the US, essentially it's all iPhone, right? And there also India practically has literally no value add per se, because if you look at our exports of smartphone to the US, we exported roughly around 6 billion to the US last year. And our actual earnings from that was just about 0.3 or $0.4 billion, which is, if I adjust for the PLI scheme, our net economic earnings or net value add to the economy was zero. So we'll end up just passing on these prices to the US per se, if at all we end up facing any tariffs, and we will not take a margin hit on our exports per se. Same with pharma. If you look at the composition of pharma, it's a low-cost, high-volume provider to the US. We roughly are around 6% of US pharma imports. But if you look at the composition of that, 50% of US generics actually are coming from India, which is difficult to replace. We are very cheap in terms of generics that we supply to the US, very competitive. Even with the cost pressure that we may face because of the tariff imposition, we won't have to face any hit, because, again, the demand is extremely inelastic from the US end. They will have to bear the price of it, not the domestic, pharma companies that are providing these supplies to the US. So there are a lot of nuances within sectors wherein we also can have bargaining power. It's not going to be a one-way street.
So let's talk, before we wrap this up, some easy wins. We could lower the import duty on some products to try and mitigate the damage. We could increase imports from the US on certain items. So take us through the easy wins in this particular scenario.
So yeah, so basically, now we are talking about India's negotiating power as well. As I said, pharma is one sector where we can actually have some bargaining chip, and when we are getting to a BTA or an FTA with the US, if at all, we can use it as a bargaining chip and ensure that we don't get hit. Secondly, where we can also try and probably shift our energy demand away from the likes of Russia to some extent to the US. Actually, it's already happening at the margin. If you look at the last 3-4 months, Russia has become an extremely important player in our energy imports. But at the margin, now the shift is happening towards North America as well. At the same time, we can also increase our defense purchases from the US. It's extremely concentrated again in terms of our defense imports to the likes of Russia. We can move a little bit away from that and give some leeway to the US. At the same time, we can reduce tariff on certain agriculture and food commodities, wherein we are actually importing a massive amount from the US, especially in apples and fruit and nuts, where we are not only imposing a very high tariff on the US, but also are importing a decent amount. So it makes sense for us to actually reduce those tariffs and let US have some market share in India, because we any which way are importing a lot from the US. Same with foreign EV policies. We can probably lower tariffs on foreign EVs, which could give some kind of a easy entry to Tesla, which obviously would be liked by the Trump administration in some form or the other, and may not necessarily hit the domestic players, because the entry point of Tesla, the cheapest Tesla that we can probably would enter Indian market, would not be less than 35-40 lakhs as per assessment, which will not hit the domestic guys, but again will hit the likes of BYDs, which are already in the Indian market at the marginal space. So I think domestically, guys may not be hit immediately in the EV space, but it could be a good bargaining power, wherein you let Tesla enter India, but also put some conditionalities that 30-40% of your production would be sourced from domestic market or Indian market. So that also helps, Indian auto component industry to some extent, but also will somewhere mollify the US administration in terms of giving them entry in certain segment where we have so far kept it very restricted. So there are these small easy wins which could reduce or mitigate part of the tariff threat. But as I said, it's going to be a long drawn process. We're not seeing the end of it immediately. I think come tonight, we will probably just hear more noises than a definitive plan from the US administration. And thus, probably for the next 6 months, we keep discussing what is the actual impact, but nobody will really have a number to that. But, from our end, we have to start discussing negotiations with them.
Thank you so much, Madhavi, for joining us, giving us a sense of what exactly to expect, especially later today when we do hear about the final imposition of the tariffs, and look forward to having you here to discuss the impact of